Hello, everyone. This is Dave with Fort Wayne VMUG. I must apologize to you and to Carl. I did not start the recording until about 5 or 10 minutes into his presentation. I've gone back through and added the slides to the video and a little bit of commentary, but there will be a link to the PDF of the slides and to his notes in the description. Carl discussed on this slide about how when he goes in to do reviews at customers that many times the domain function level and forest levels are still older versions of Active Directory. And that many customers are kind of scared to change this as they don't want to break anything. But in order to get the newer functionality and the newer enhancements in replication and that such, they need to increase that. As mentioned in the intro, I will link to the PDF with his notes as well in that to give more information on it. On this slide, Carl was discussing that when you move to a domain function level of server 2008 or higher, that it does not, the sysvol replication does not automatically migrate to DFSR from FRS. So in his notes, he has some information on migrating. Then he also has a link there at the bottom of the slide that talks about that, and that this is highly important before you can add a 2019 server to your domain.
In a domain controller. And that's one of the things I find when I'm doing Active Directory assessments and health checks is that it's actually very common for people to undersize remote domain controllers. So they can have a domain controller in a small site, like say Fargo, North Dakota, and they may only give it like 2 gig of RAM, but yet their Active Directory database is 4 gig in size, which means they're probably also going to need close to 4 gig for the global catalog, and they may need 1 or 2 gig for DNS. And that domain controller is just sitting there paging itself to death, which causes unoptimal logon experiences for users. So what does the global catalog do in the logon process? Well, when a domain user logs on interactively, and by interactively, I mean they're actually doing a Control-Alt-Delete, not like a service account that's running, you know, something under the hood and authenticating. If you do Control-Alt-Delete, the contacted domain controller, and we'll cover this process in a few slides, must retrieve information from a global catalog server if your domain functional level is Windows 2000 or later, because you may be using universal groups and we don't know what domain that universal group belongs to, or you may use a UPN. I could do david@abc.com, well, my actual domain is amalgamatedbiscuitcorporation.com. And we don't want users always typing in, you know, david@amalgamatedbiscuitcorporation.com. We want them just doing david@abc.com. Well, if they do david@abc.com, there's no abc.com domain. So it actually has to contact the global catalog server in order to hit that, in order to determine what abc.com is. And so if you don't make every domain controller a global catalog server, you're going to have domain controllers going all over your environment, you know, referring a user that's trying to log on to a domain controller that's a global catalog server, and therefore you're slowing down the logon process. In other words, your users are not getting the optimal logon experience. So the bottom line is configure all domain controllers as global catalog servers. And in explaining how the global catalog works, Microsoft states it is recommended to make all domain controllers be global catalog servers. So pardon the bad English, but that's directly from Microsoft. But now I can already hear some of you who have taken the old MCSE certification exams. You're saying, but what about the infrastructure master? Everyone knows the domain controller that hosts the infrastructure master can't be a global catalog server. Well, what most people don't or have not done is read the second half of that Microsoft article, because the infrastructure master updates cross-domain references in phantoms from the global catalog. So if you're smart and you're in a forest that contains only a single Active Directory domain, which is a Microsoft recommendation, there are no phantoms, and therefore the infrastructure master does absolutely nothing. And even if you're part of a multiple domain forest, if every domain controller is a global catalog server, there are no phantoms, and therefore there's nothing for the infrastructure master to do. So it doesn't matter what domain controller holds the infrastructure master FSMO row. If you have one domain, infrastructure master does nothing. If you have multiple domains and every domain controller is a global catalog server, there's absolutely nothing for the infrastructure master to do. All right. Any questions on the global catalog? So if you want to make sure all your users are getting an optimal logon experience, make all domain controllers a global catalog server. Connection objects. This is one of the things that most admins really misunderstand. So what should be there? What I look for is automatically generated. And unless you're using read-only domain controllers, that should be the only thing you see in sites and services for connection objects is automatically generated. But a lot of places, I find there's lots of manual connection objects. So why are manual connection objects there? Because most admins have no idea how the knowledge consistency checker or the KCC works. Again, Microsoft has a very detailed article on how it works. So the way the KCC works is the KCC is actually a DLL on every domain controller, and every domain controller is independent. When you boot up a domain controller, when you get to where you can, do the interactive logon, press Control-Alt-Delete to log on, at that point, a 5-minute countdown starts. After 5 minutes, the KCC kicks in because it's waiting for everything, to settle down. It's also waiting for the Active Directory database to load into RAM. It's waiting for the global catalog to load into RAM. It's waiting, if you use a Microsoft DNS, it's waiting for DNS to load into RAM. Once that 5 minutes is done, the KCC goes out and builds a replication topology between all the domain controllers in the environment. And every domain controller is independent, and the KCC on every domain controller will build an independent topology, and they're all exactly the same. So no matter which domain controller you go and look at the replication topology, they're all exactly the same. One of the most common misconceptions is that the domain controller or AD replication is a full mesh replication topology. That's the most common misunderstanding. So since I'm a lab rat, spent a lot of time in my lab, I actually built from 2 through 7 domain controllers, and then recorded how the replication topology was built. So you can see here, 1 and 2 talk to each other, 2 and 4 talk to each other, 4 and 3 talk to each other, and 3 and 1 talk to each other. What you don't see, 2 and 3 don't talk, 1 and 4 don't talk directly. Now, the maximum number of domain controllers you can have in a domain is 1023. Of course, I always wonder who was the poor fool who brought up the 1024th domain controller in a domain and cause an issue and cause Microsoft to actually have to document that you can only have 1023. Even if you have 1023 domain controllers in a domain, no domain controller is more than 3 hops away from any other domain controller. So in other words, if I make a change, like add a new user on DC3, that change will go to DC1, which then goes to DC2, or it can go to DC4, which goes to DC2. And so within 3 hops, that change is going to make it there. So if we go to 7 DCs, now in this case, DC7 is a read-only domain controller. Fortunately, most people have gotten away from read-only domain controllers because they're actually more trouble than they're worth. Because most applications, including those from VMware and Citrix, require, well, they desire a read-write domain controller. So if you put a read-only domain controller in a remote site and you're using a VMware or Citrix or Microsoft application or technology that wants a read-write domain controller, it's got to be referred to that read-write domain controller. So now you're crossing your WAN link in order to get to a read-write domain controller and then come back. And that information is never cached on a read-only domain controller. So I don't like read-only domain controllers, and most people have gotten away from them. So even in this case, since a read-only domain controller is not authoritative, I can't add users on DC7. So if I'm an admin and I go to that remote site where DC7 is, and I bring up ADUC is going to connect to a read-write domain controller. And then I'm going to add, so let's say I'm at where DC7 is, I'm going to connect to probably DC1, and I can make the change, and it will go back to DC7. And then let's say the DC4, so DC1 is going to go to DC2, DC2 is going to go to DC4. So no matter how you look at it on this screen, no matter which domain controller I make a change on, all domain controllers are within 3 hops of each other. Now there is a nice trick. It's actually not a trick. It's actually a Microsoft recommendation. If you have multiple sites and you have a domain controller or domain controllers in the remote sites, Microsoft recommends that you enable what's called change notification without compression. You don't want to enable compression because the compression uses the domain controller CPU to compress, and you really don't want to tax the CPU on a domain controller. What change notification does when you enable it is it will treat all domain controllers in all sites as if they were doing intra-site replication, not inter-site replication. Where dependent upon the number of sites you have and the number of domain controllers you have, if you were to add a user on DC1, it could take hours for it to get to one of the remote sites because the default time interval for replicating between AD sites is 180 minutes. Microsoft recommends that you change that to 15 minutes, and then that you also enable change notification without compression. So when you do that, you can take your convergence time for Active Directory replication from hours down to mere minutes. Because another thing most people don't understand, domain controllers talk to each other every 5 seconds. All domain controllers within a site talk to each other every 5 seconds. Do you have anything for me? Do you have anything for me? Do you have anything for me? And after 5 minutes, it says, just to make sure, send me everything that you've done in the last 5 minutes. And so there's all this constant communication that's going on. Also, domain controllers refresh all the group policies that are linked to the domain controllers OU every 5 minutes. So they're constantly being refreshed. You know, security updates. If I make a change on one domain controller, it will get to another domain controller pretty darn quick within that site. And if you have the change notification enabled, it will get to the other domain controllers and other sites quickly. And all of that is to serve our users, because obviously, well, maybe not obviously. To me, my opinion is our #1 job in IT is to serve our users, because if we're not for the users using the services we provide, there would be no need for us and we would not have a job. So all these suggestions are how to make the best possible logon experience for your users. Because if you're using any virtualization, if you're using Citrix XenApp, or you're using AppV, or you're using VMware, application or server or desktop virtualization, we want the users accessing our virtualized desktops to log on as quickly as possible, get group policy applied as quickly as possible, so that they stay out of our hair and leave help desk alone. All right, any questions? Because that's a lot to cover for connection objects. So the thing is, because KCC is so smart, it's so smart that even if you have 1023 domain controllers, they do not talk to each other to create the replication topology, and they will all create the exact same replication topology. The only time that breaks is when you go and put in a manual connection object. So say I go in there and put a manual connection object between DC3 and DC2. What happens if DC3 dies and goes away, or I get rid of it because it's a 2003 domain controller and we're getting rid of it and we now have DC3A? Well, in the normal course of events, if you demote a domain controller and it demotes properly, the KCC is going to know about it and remove it from the replication topology. If you created a manual connection object, the KCC says, hands off, you said you're smarter than me, I'm not going to remove it. And now you've got broken AD replication.
All own up to putting manual entries in. Well, so how do you fix that? You just go remove them?
Yep, just go and remove it. And I have got people who are absolutely petrified. I mean, they're literally having a panic attack when I go in there and tell them we're going to remove all your manual connection objects. Because if you have created all your site links, so we know how site 1 connects to site 2 and site 2 connects to site 3 connects to site 4, or maybe site 3 doesn't connect to site 4. But if you go in there and tell it that site 1 connects to site 2, site 1 connects to site 3, site 1 does not connect to site 4, but site 2 and site 3 connect to each other, and site 3 connects to site 4.
I think that was my issue, was that my remote offices were trying to talk to each other to replicate, but it was flowing the way the VPN set up. It wasn't happening. So I guess I'm missing a step there for sure.
Yeah, you have to have all your site links connected or configured properly, and what we're going to fix and come up next, you have to have all your subnets defined, and then your sites connected to subnets, or I'm sorry, your subnets connected to the sites connected to site links. Once you have those 3 things done, then just leave it alone and let the KCC do it, sprinkle its magic pixie dust over everything, and it will connect everything. If you think that a DC in site 3 should be connecting to a DC in site 4, and there's absolutely nothing connecting site 3 to site 4, you've got something wrong in your actual external communications. There's nothing wrong in Active Directory. Active Directory says, I can't find a way to connect those. And you have to go in and then create the site link that says, hey, site 3 can connect to site 4. And once you create that, within just a few seconds, the KCC will come out and create that connection object for you. You should never manually connect anything in site 3 to site 4. If you don't get an automatic connection created and something's not replicating, you have something misconfigured either in your actual, the way you've got your VPNs or your WAN connections or your MPLS or however, you've got something wrong there. And communication is not happening. Because I'm finishing up a huge migration for two law firms, one in Minneapolis. So the law firm in Minneapolis got acquired by a law firm in Kansas City, and they kept saying, we're having issues with the domain controller in Fargo, North Dakota for the remote site. Well, come to find out, they had a broken link and they didn't know it. And they were wondering why all these weird issues for the one user in Fargo. And then once they realized that, oh, they actually had a piece of equipment that died. And the only way they knew it was, well, hey, this user's not getting their group policy when they log in. And their password changed and they're not getting their updated password. Because they changed the password months ago, but it never replicated, and all because of a piece of broken communications equipment. Nothing wrong with AD. So, all right, any other questions or comments? All right, Microsoft makes this nice Active Directory replication status tool. They released it, so this is a funny one. They released it in 2012. It had all kinds of issues, so they removed it. Took them 4 years to fix it. They didn't re-release it until 2016. Well, actually, April 2016. Then they updated it in September 2016, then August 2017, September 2018, and then most recently in January 2020. As you can see on the screen, date published January 13, 2020. The version is still 1.1. Even the very first version of this tool is version 1.1. The installer says it's installing version 1.0, but if you go and look in, the programs and features, the latest version is 3.2.113.800. And this will give you lots of information on all the replication that's going on in your Active Directory. And you can open that in Excel, you can export it, do all kinds of stuff so that you can go out there and figure out what may be wrong with your AD replication. It is a nice tool, quick to install, very easy to use. You can actually go in there and say, hey, check replication for the forest, or you can have it check replication for a specific domain if you have multiple domains. All right, as I previously mentioned, subnets not defined. So for our virtual desktops, this is one of the most critical things for user logon experience. I mean, it's like number 1, number 2, or number 1 and number 2 are like 1A and 1B. One may be, 51 and one's 49%. But this is so critical. So why are subnets important? Well, they help computers find the closest domain controller. And for Exchange, if you're still running on-premises Exchange, they help Exchange find the optimal routing for email traffic. So how is a domain controller found? So if I'm bringing up a new client, when the client comes up, now I'm not talking about the user. The client here is referring to the computer. When the computer comes up, the computer queries for all DCs in the domain. It does that by DNS, which is why DNS is so critical. It's going to retrieve all the SRV records from _TCP.domain. It's going to attempt an LDAP bind to every single one of those domain controllers. So if you've got, and I have had this, hundreds of domain controllers in a domain, it's going to attempt to connect to every single one of them. The first DC that responds examines the client's IP, looks at all the subnets defined in sites and services. If there's a subnet defined, it's going to refer the client to a domain controller in that site. If a subnet is not defined, then that first DC that responded now becomes the authenticating domain controller, regardless of where the client is in your environment and regardless of where that domain controller is in your environment. And the reason this is so critical is many years ago, right when virtualization really started to become a thing, I got a call to do an AD health check because the client couldn't figure out why their 56K dial-up lease line to Shanghai, China, which averaged maybe a couple of $100 a month in communications charges, all of a sudden was $38,000. Come to find out that when they brought a new building online, when those clients all came on, it just so happened to be that domain controller in Shanghai, China was configured with SNMP to connect at a specific time of the day to get all the Active Directory updates. It was the first to respond. And because they had not, the networking team, you know, they had already set up the routers, the firewalls, the switches, the web content filters, you know, all that stuff for the networking team had all been set up for the new subnet. No one bothered to tell the Windows team or the Active Directory team, we got a new subnet. So the domain controller in Shanghai, China was the authenticating domain controller. And because it takes a little while to authenticate and get all the group policies down, it was sitting there responding to every client in that building. And what do computers do every 90 minutes plus or minus a 30-minute random offset? Refresh group policy. Where are they going to get group policy? From their authenticating domain controller, which just happens to be over a 56K dial-up lease line in Shanghai, China. So if you want to keep your telecommunications bills down, so can you imagine the logon experience over a 56K dial-up lease line from Anderson, Indiana? That's where this actually happened, in Anderson, Indiana, to Shanghai, China. I don't really think those users in that new building were very impressed with their first logon to the network. All right, so we go on. The client has now stored that site in its registry, what we call domain controller affinity. Is going to store that. So now the client is going to query for all the DCs in that site. And then it's going to retrieve all the SRV records. And then it's going to attempt an LDAP bind to all. In the case for Shanghai, China, there was only the one domain controller. If you have multiple domain controllers, the same thing happens. It's going to attempt to LDAP bind to all domain controllers in that site. And then the first DC to respond authenticates, the client forms an affinity. So, subsequently, if I shut down all those computers in the new building that night, you know, hey, it's 6:30, the branch is closed and everyone shuts down. Then we come in the morning, we turn everything back on. All of them are going to go back to the domain controller that they have in the registry, which in our case, in this example, is the domain controller in Shanghai, China. And it's just a rinse, lather, repeat. And now if you actually have subnets defined and we actually have a domain controller in the site, then that will be there and the client will then bind to that closest domain controller. And then if that DC goes offline, for some reason it's not available, maybe you're applying Windows updates, it's rebooting and it's taking an hour and a half to reboot. If that client comes on, it's going to say, hey, my DC is offline. it's going to go back to step 5, which says, hey, I need to query DNS for all domain controllers in my site. It's going to get another domain controller, and now it's going to be have an affinity for that domain controller. If for some reason you say, hey, this new building that we put in, we're now going to move that to another Active Directory site. We're actually going to create an Active Directory site for that. Very simple. You create a site. You say, hey, this is the subnet that is associated with this site. The next time the clients come on, the domain controller, as we saw back here in step 3, the domain controller that authenticated them previously is going to examine that client's IP. It's going to look, do we have any new subnet definitions? Oh, we do. This subnet is, the subnet is now affiliated with this site. It's going to go to DNS and say, okay, hey, I need all the domain controllers in this new site. It's going to, the first DC that responds, then becomes the authenticating domain controller. So there's a lot of detail in here. The main thing is, if you don't have subnets defined properly, you are affecting your users, and you're affecting their logon experience, and you're affecting their group policy application. All right. Any questions on how a domain controller is found? It can be expensive for you or whoever pays the bills. It can be expensive for your users, and it can be expensive for the help desk if you don't have your subnets defined, because the users are going to, inundate the help desk. Why is it taking me so long to log on? Why, am I not getting all the group policies and stuff like that? So subnets are very important. So how do we find missing subnets? Well, so there's these mythical things that exist. They're called event logs. Most people don't realize these things exist, but they're on every Windows computer. So one time at a Bri forum, I said, so now that you know about event logs, you are now a member of Webster's Ultra Secret Society. And a couple of people after a few seconds went, WUSS. I'm a wuss. So you're going to monitor your system event log on every domain controller for event ID 5807 source net logon. You can also run this script from my friend Jeremy Saunders, and it will go out there and go through the C Windows debug log netlogon.log on every domain controller, because every domain controller is independent. Because remember, we're picking a domain controller. So every domain controller authenticates different clients. So you want to find that. Oh, and I forgot to mention at the start. So you're going to get a copy. I've already given it to David. There's a copy of the slide deck and a PDF. So all these links, you can have, and all the notes. There's lots of notes for most of the slides. So you'll have all my notes and everything. But you run this, it'll create you a CSV file. You load that into Excel, do some sort, do some cleanup, and you can find. It says finding missing subnets, but actually what it's doing is finding missing IP addresses, because we don't know if I find or his script finds an IP address, 10.1.2.3. What's the subnet? Is it 10.0? Is it a 10.1? I don't know. That's for you. You could have a 10.8. That's the other thing. Subnets, you can actually have a 10/8. You could have a 10.10/16. You could have a 10.10.1/ whatever. You could actually have a 10.11.12.13/32. And when a client comes up and a DC is looking for a subnet and it's looking at that client's IP address, it's going to use the most specific subnet that you defined. So if you want to make sure that any new devices go to, like, say, your main data center's domain controllers. You could do, and say you're using the 10 dot IP scheme, you could actually have a 10.0.0.0/8 and associate that with your main data center AD site. Therefore, if they do happen to bring up a new site and they're using 10.20 and you don't have a subnet defined for 10.20, it's going to go to 10.0/8 and say the new computers go to the main data center. That way they're not going off to Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, California, or Shanghai, China. You can at least get them into a data center that has a high-speed connection to it. All right, any questions, comments on subnets? All right, DNS reverse lookup zones. So once we have created all of our subnets and sites and services, we need to create a reverse lookup zone in DNS. Now, I finally got off my big fat lazy butt, and last year actually created a script to do this, only because for that big AD migration project I was talking about, they were also doing a big VMware lift, a big VMware build up to enable all the resources from the Milwaukee area to come into the Kansas City data center. So they built up a massive VMware stuff. And they had 270 subnets defined. And I was not going to go through and manually create 270 reverse lookup zones. So I finally created a script that will go through and it reads all the subnets defined in sites and services, and then will create you your reverse lookup zones. So even if you just have one, this script will do it faster than you can do it manually. It did all 270 in less than 2 seconds. Now I have been asked to create the opposite. What if we have a bunch of reverse DNS lookup zones and we now need to put that stuff in sites and services? That's not that easy, because you have to have enterprise admin rights to create subnets. And I don't like creating scripts that are going to change something in Active Directory that requires you to have enterprise admin rights. So I'm trying to figure out a way to do it, and at least just come up with a report saying, hey, here's what you need to do, and here's the PowerShell to do it, but you run it yourself. I don't want to take responsibility for messing up your, sites and services. Now, one thing, Active Directory does not require reverse DNS. Active Directory can work from here to the end of time without reverse DNS, and you'll never have an issue. But if you use any of these listed Citrix products or any of these VMware products, they require reverse DNS. And most of these products, both VMware, Citrix, and other vendors, what they do is they will first try reverse DNS 3 times before they will time out and go back to your classic A record lookup. So by not having reverse DNS, you're increasing your name resolution time, because it's going to try reverse DNS, reverse DNS, reverse DNS. I give up. Let's go back and do a standard A record lookup. So any Citrix product, any VMware product, you better have reverse DNS in your environment. All right, any questions on reverse DNS? All right, duplicate DNS entries. This is the other thing that is that close 1 and 2, the subnets, is duplicate DNS entries. And this all goes down to how DNS is configured. So how and why are unintentional duplicate DNS records created? You can have intentional duplicate DNS records. It is entirely possible, feasible, and likely that you've got like mail, OA, OMA, exchange, auto discover, all pointing to one IP address, you know, probably a cluster or something. And the same thing, you can have like www could point to 100 different IP addresses, you know, on a web server farm. So those are intentional duplicates, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. What I'm talking about are the unintentional duplicates, and that I see that a lot in companies that lease their desktops or lease their thin clients, and they have their thin clients registering in DNS. The lease expires. The lease company comes in at night and just turns everything off, unplugs all the cables, brings in something new, plugs in all the cables, turns it on, and they're out the door without removing anything from Active Directory. So not only do you still have all of these old DNS records, you've also got all these old stale computer accounts in Active Directory. Believe it or not, DNS aging and scavenging is not enabled by default. Because if aging and scavenging were enabled by default, well, if I've gotten a DNS or if I've got an IP address from DHCP and I've registered in DNS, and then that record expires or has aged out or is no longer valid, scavenging, well, it would age, and then scavenging will go out there and clean it up. But that's not enabled by default. So there's never any cleanup. So the second AD migration project I did was I was brought in to a company in Houston that was being their child domain was being split out into its own Active Directory forest. And the parent company could not get, they were using ADMT. And if you have any experience with Active Directory migration tool, ADMT from Microsoft, almost, well, no matter who the vendor is, all Active Directory migration products use an agent on the endpoint that runs to allow it, you know, to re-ACL folders and files and join the domain and be in both domains. And so a user can log in and all that stuff. They could not get it to work. And they'd been working on it for a month. So they actually fly me down to Houston. I get in there. And what we found out was that if I'm sitting on this computer and I ping PC1, I get one IP address. If I go to this computer and I ping PC1, I get a completely different IP address. Well, what we found out was that PC1 had 21 different IP addresses. And almost every IP address in DNS pointed to 20 plus computer names. So obviously, name resolution was helter-skelter. It all depended upon which DNS server the computer was pointing to for primary DNS was dependent upon how name resolution worked. And so we actually had to go in there and do a massive cleanup of their DNS before they could get their Active Directory migration to work. And it was all because even though this is a big company and they had a dedicated Active Directory team, the Active Directory team knew nothing about DNS aging and scavenging, and DNS wasn't set up properly. So aging and scavenging, you got to enable it in 5 places: on the DNS server, server properties, every forward lookup zone, every reverse lookup zone, and then via the command line, you have to set a scavenging server. So all DNS servers will scavenge. So if you're familiar with Active Directory conflict resolution, so if David goes on DC1 and Justin goes to DC2, and both of you add Tom Wagner as a new user into Active Directory at literally the same time, which one wins? How do we know which one wins? It's going to do it by date and time. The first one that got saved, write first wins. Unlike with roaming profiles, will write last one. Here, now it's got, and then, so David's saved his first. Now Justin saves his, and Active Directory goes, oh, wait a minute. It's trying to do replication. Now it's got to resolve that conflict. And how is it going to do that? It's going to look at, USN IDs and date and time of the creation and all this stuff to determine which Tom Wagner user account are we going to keep? Which one has the valid information? So it's got to go through all of that. You don't want every DNS server scavenging DNS records, because if you've got a couple of hundred domain controllers, and if you have DNS configured on all of them, do you want hundreds of domain controllers deleting the same DNS records? And then during all that replication, you want Active Directory spending all that time trying to figure out who deleted it first? And what happens if DC1 deleted it, but DC2 didn't? Do we keep it or do we delete it? So Microsoft recommendation is that you set one scavenging server for DNS. And even in the largest Active Directory, Microsoft doesn't recommend more than two. Maybe one for the Americas continent, and maybe one for the EMEA, but you wouldn't do one for Canada, one for United States, one for Mexico, and so on. You wouldn't do that. So we set it. You can go to agents, right click your DNS server, go to set agent scavenging for all zones, and then check the boxes. And then this box on the bottom window, apply these settings to the existing AD integrated zones. You select that, click OK, off it goes. My problem is this only works like 50 to 75% of the time. So you still have to manually go and check all the zones, which is easy to do. You can do that with PowerShell from the command line. You can go out there and just, here are all the zones, and it'll tell you which ones, have the aging and scavenging. Now, can anyone tell me why the default is 7 days for aging and for refresh? All right. This goes into the very tight integration between Microsoft. Now this is specifically for Microsoft DNS, Microsoft DHCP. If you're using InfoBlocks or what's the other device, Blue Cat or something like that, they've got their own thing and they handle things their own way. So I'm specifically talking about Microsoft here. So Microsoft DNS, DHCP, what is the default least duration for a scope in Microsoft DHCP? 8 days. A DHCP record will attempt to renew itself at 50%. If it doesn't get refreshed, it tries again at 87.5% of the least duration. 87.5% of 8 is 7. That's why all the defaults are 7 days. All the numbers are 7 because everything is based on an 8-day DHCP least duration. If you now, I don't care about Wi-Fi, guest devices, servers, because usually all your servers are going to have static IPs. Agent and scavenging does not touch static IPs unless you're stupid. I'm sorry, didn't mean to say that. Unless you're unwise and you right-click your DNS server and you say scavenge stale resource records. If you ever select that option, you can find yourself with missing static DNS records because you have now told DNS, I'm smarter than you, go out there and clean up everything, including static IPs. So Static IPs are typically refreshed every 60 minutes, especially domain controllers. Domain controllers are constantly refreshing themselves, their DNS records, to make sure all their SRV records are in DNS and that their A records are in DNS. They're constantly updating themselves. So the timestamp on the static records should be no more than 1 hour old. If you look in your DNS console and you sort by the last column and you're looking for static IPs, if you see any static IPs that are more than 1 hour old, you got something wrong. Because that static IP, that server, that computer with the static IP should have refreshed DNS within the last hour. If it's not, go to that. So let's say you got a file server that had, and it's got, say, a static IP, a timestamp of 2 weeks ago. Go to an elevated command prompt, do ipconfig/register DNS, press enter, wait about 15 minutes, refresh the DNS console, and see if that record refreshed. If it didn't, something's wrong. All right. Any questions on that process? So aging and scavenging will not affect, and I've had people say, well, it deleted all my static IP records or deleted a bunch of them. And I go, no, it doesn't. And they go, well, I went up there and I said, scavenge stale resource records. And I said, that's not scavenging process. That's a manual process. You told it to scavenge old stuff, and it did exactly what you told it to do. And of course, it's easy to fix. Reboot the server. If you can't reboot the server, elevated command prompt, ipconfig, register DNS, boom, the static DNS records are put back in. It's no big deal. No reason to panic. No reason to have a stress effect. You may want to go out and have a couple of beers afterwards, but you know, there's really no cause for alarm. All right. You also need to do it on the server. And then for each reverse and DNS lookup zone, you need to go in and set that there. And as you can see, all the defaults are 7 days. And then you need to go and set a scavenging server. Now, looking at this, only because I've done this hundreds of times, I can tell if I did this in your Active Directory environment and I ran this command DNS-CMD/zoneinfo, your domain name, and this is what came up, I could tell instantly you don't have a DNS scavenge server configured. And the way I can tell that is if I go in and actually run the command, DNS commands, your so I recommend you always use the domain controller that hosts the PDC emulator FSMO role. We'll explain why later. Then /zone reset scavenging servers, your domain or the zone name, and then the IP address of that domain controller. And then we'll tell you that the command completed successfully. And then you see in the red, the word scavenge servers. You now have a scavenge server configured. And if we compare them, you see, I got more information. And just by looking at that, I can see the word scavenge servers. And I know that you have a scavenge server configured. If you don't have DNS aging scavenging configured properly. If I were doing an Active Directory assessment on your environment, this would be one of the findings. All right, so now that we've gone through, we talked about duplicate DNS records. We've talked about how to configure aging and scavenging. So now how do we find duplicate DNS records? All right, you don't have to, but I recommend that you manually clean up unintentional duplicate entries before you enable aging and scavenging. You don't have to. I just recommend you do that because it allows you to see what's in your DNS. And most people are surprised because they never look in DNS and they go, oh man, these servers haven't existed in years. Why are they still in DNS? Or oh man, we renamed that server. Why is the old one still in there? It gives them a chance. It may not be a duplicate, but it gives you a chance to actually see all the crud that's been lingering around in your DNS for possibly years or decades, and gives you a chance to go out there and clean that crud up. So you can do a manual cleanup. And then my friend, my main AD and PowerShell mentor, Michael B. Smith, he wrote a script for my website, find duplicate DNS records. So it's easy to run. You just run this script, out file to some file, and then you can take that file and open it up into Excel, import it into Excel. It's delimited, unselect tabs, select comma, put it in there, and boom, there you go. And then, now this is actually live customer data. This customer, I had to go and change some things, but they allowed me to actually use their data all these years for this presentation. But as you can see, they had 2,638 duplicate host names. And they had over 3,400 duplicate IP addresses. So now they their DNS, they had over 16,000 DNS records. How long do you think, if you scanned one record per second, how long would it take you to find all the duplicate DNS records? Where Michael's script will go out and process all of this, like it processed all 16,000 in like less than 1 second, and gives you a nice Excel file. Now, I always remind people, I'm talking about unintentional duplicate DNS records. The customer that this was for, they had a new admin, and the new admin went out there and deleted every single one of these DNS records. Messed up Citrix, messed up VMware, messed up email. Email instantly stopped working. Wasn't a very good thing to do. So we're only talking about unintentional duplicate DNS records. All right. So now we have one more thing. If you're running Microsoft DHCP on a domain controller with Microsoft DNS, by default, Microsoft DHCP can add and update DNS records. It cannot delete DNS records. You have to configure what are called DNS dynamic update credentials. You can actually monitor for event ID 1056. It basically just comes up and says, the DHCP service has detected it's running on a domain controller and you don't have credentials configured for dynamic DNS registrations. So just create you an account. It's a plain regular domain user account, just like one you would use for LDAP queries. And another soapbox, why people use domain admin accounts for LDAP queries baffles me. But it's just a regular domain user account. And if you do it via it's a server option if you do it via the command line or PowerShell, but in the GUI, it's added at the protocol level. I don't know why the difference. And so you just right click in the GUI, you would right click one of the protocols, go to properties, advanced, credentials. I recommend people use the username DNS dynamic update cred because it's obvious what it is. And then in the display properties for the account, I recommend putting in there, do not change password or delete this account. Now, DHCP, even in a cluster, DHCP is independent. So even if you have a failover cluster, you have to configure this on each node in the failover cluster. If you have multiple DHCP servers, you have to configure this on every DHCP server. So if you've got 100 Microsoft DHCP servers, like maybe one for every remote site or remote location, you have to configure this, which is why I recommend just doing it with PowerShell. Because with PowerShell, you can almost do, a one-liner. Hey, get me all the, DHCP servers that are in directory services and pipe it into, and then, create this. and then set it for every DHCP server. If you don't do this, this is another reason you get duplicate DNS records. Because if I bring up a test VM, like I'm testing up some Horizon stuff, and they all go out to DHCP, they all get an IP address, they all register in DNS, and I'm done, and I just power them off and delete the VMs. They're still, those records are still in DNS. Computer accounts are still going to be in Active Directory, but their records are still going to be in DNS. They can't be deleted because DHCP can't delete DNS records unless you create this. All right. Any questions? Because this is a very tight integration. If you don't have Microsoft DNS and Microsoft, specifically if you're running Microsoft DHCP on a domain controller, which a lot of people do. If you don't have DNS and DHCP configured properly, they're going to have all kinds of, dubious records in DNS. And the other thing, so this has nothing to do with this talk. I'm just going to bring it up because I do a lot of AD migrations. And so when you bring up, or let's say all your domain controllers are 2008 R2, you're going to replace them all. You're using DFSR for sysvol. Everything's good. You want to bring up some 2019 domain controllers. You're going to replace all your 2008 R2 domain controllers, but you want to reuse the old domain controller names and IP addresses because you've got a bunch of applications, hard coded for those names and IP addresses. When you demote an old domain controller, if you don't manually go out there and clean up DNS of all those SRV records, when you bring up the new 2019 domain controller with the previous name of the old 2008 R2 domain controller, guess which computer account owns, guess which self account owns those DNS records? That old 2008 R2 computer account. Doesn't matter, they're the same name. Just like if I create, a J Jones in Active Directory and I delete it and I instantly create another J Jones user account, the SID's different. I'm thinking they're the same account, but they're not. The same way with computer accounts. I've created a new computer account. That new computer account has a new GUID. It has a new SID. It's not the same owner for those SRV records that are sitting in DNS. So if you're going to reuse names and IP addresses, you have to go and manually delete all those. And I'm talking about, you go to like your domain name, like in here, labaddomain.com. You would expand, where it says _MCS_labaddomain.com or labaddomain.com. And you have to expand every single one of those subnodes in DNS. And you have to delete every single one of those SRV records, because every one of those SRV records is owned by the old self object belonging to the old computer account. All right. That's one of the reasons a lot of people say, I want to reuse names, but it's not working, or it appears to work, but now I'm getting all these weird errors in DNS and Active Directory. That's because the new domain controller can't register those SRV records. All right. That's a little bonus for your group there, David. All right, orphan domain controllers. Orphan domain controllers are domain controllers just like computers. They've died, they've blue screened, or you just got rid of them, whether they were physical or virtual. The physical may have died, maybe the drive crashed, maybe something happened, you got rid of all physical domain controllers, but you never DC promoted, or it died and you never DC promoted. It's still sitting out there in DNS. It's still sitting out there in Active Directory for KCC to put it into the replication topology, which is why people get weird replication errors in Active Directory, in DNS, and sysvol. So how do you spot an orphan DC? those mythical things called event logs. The event logs are screaming at you with errors in the system event log. And then also in the Active Directory related event logs saying, I'm trying to contact, dead DC1 and I can't, but it still exists. I'll try again later. And it will just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. How do you remove an orphan DC? Back in the old days, man, if all you had were 2003 or earlier domain controllers, you had a 31-step process that you had to go through using NTDS-util to go through and clean out the domain controller, the sites and services, all those records, the global catalog, PDC, all that stuff, you had to go out there and clean. But if you have at least one 2008 or higher domain controller, or you have a 2008 or later server, or a desktop OS at the same level with RSAT installed, piece of cake. Find that orphan domain controller in ADUC, right-click, delete, gone. Now, you still have to manually delete it from sites and services. Even if you properly demote a domain controller, it's still sitting in sites and services. Even if you properly demote a domain controller, 5% of the SRV records still exist in DNS. You have to go through and manually, and I have found that to be 100% true. It does not always clean out all the SRV records, and it never cleans out the name server tab. So if you demote a domain controller and it's on the name server tab for any forward or reverse lookup zone, it's still going to be there. But now it's just going to say unknown instead of having an IP address. And it's still going to be there saying, I'm a name server. I don't exist anymore, but you're telling me I'm still a name server. Why does that? I have no idea why Microsoft doesn't automatically clean that. That's one of these things I plan to do. If I ever get off my big fat lazy butt again, I'll write a script to go out there and clean out all that stuff. All right. The PDC emulator FSMO row holder is not configured properly for time server. So what is the PDC emulator? So the PDC emulator has a lot of specific functions. In Active Directory, all domain controllers are equal. But the domain controller that hosts the PDC emulator FSMO row is the most equal of all domain controllers. There are 17 things in Active Directory that only happen on the PDC emulator. For this section here, we're talking, it is the authoritative time server for the domain. When a user changes their password, I don't care where they are in the world or what AD site they're on, when they change their password, the authenticating domain controller instantly tells the PDC emulator this user changed their password. So now, if the user goes someplace else and fat fingers their password, that authenticating domain controller has to verify with the PDC emulator domain controller, did the user change their password and it just hasn't been replicated to me yet? So the PDC emulator domain controller is the most critical domain controller, the most equal. It should be your most reliable, most stable domain controller. So how do we configure time server stuff? Well, Microsoft has this article here, and it actually has a Mr. Fix-It on it, but don't use it because that Mr. Fix-It has never worked, not at all. So there are 3 things that must be configured properly on the PDC emulator in order to configure it as the authoritative time server. You have to set the type, must be set to NTP, announce flags must be set to 5, and then you have to set an external time server. Now, I recommend using servers from pool.ntp.org. You may have your own time server device appliance or something. That's fine. You may be using a networking appliance. That's fine. If you're not, I recommend using north-america.pool.ntp.org, 0x8. Now, the 0x8 or 0x1 or 0x9 must be there, and you separate those by spaces. Did someone have a question? Nope. All right. Then once you do that, then stop and start the Windows 32 time. But don't do it manually anymore. My friend Jeremy Saunders has a script for this, and it's what I use on every AD project, and I use in my lab. I use his script. It will go out there and create you 3 GPOs and 2 WMI filters. It creates you a WMI filter that says, I'm the domain controller that hosts the PDC emulator FSMO row, and I'm a computer that does not hold the PDC emulator FSMO row. And then it creates 3 group policies, one for the PDC emulator, one for the domain controller, or that's not a PDC emulator, and then for one for all computers in the environment. And the nice thing about doing his is that once you have everything set, you never have to worry about it again. Now, Jeremy's from Australia, so his script, he actually has some time servers in there from Australia. So I just recommend changing that one line in there to here. And again, the nice thing about is if you manually transfer the PDC emulator FSMO row to another domain controller, within just a few seconds, the new PDC emulator is going to pick up that group policy, and it says, oh, I'm now the authoritative time server. Here are all my registry configurations. The previous authoritative time server domain controller is going to say, oh, I'm no longer the authoritative time server. Here are the changes I need to make to my registry. And so you never, ever have to worry about it again. So once you make that change on the PDC emulator, you'll get 2 new system event log entries. And then on the other computers in the domain, eventually, within 15 minutes or so, you'll start seeing that they will start recording. Now, recently on Experts Exchange, I answered a question because someone was concerned that not every computer in the domain was going to the PDC emulator to get time. That's not the way the Windows time hierarchy works. If you're not a domain controller, you find a domain controller to use as your time server. Could be the PDC emulator, could not be. If you are a domain controller that is not the PDC emulator, you will go to the PDC emulator domain controller as your authoritative time server. If you're in a multi-domain forest, the PDC emulator domain controller for the domain or in the child domain will go to the parent domain PDC emulator domain controller for its authoritative time source. So Windows has a really nice, elaborate, built-in default time hierarchy. There's no reason to try and circumvent it. Just let it work, and it works. If you try and go and change a bunch of registry keys and manually do a bunch of stuff, you can just screw things up, and then things start falling apart in Active Directory. Now, one common misconception, people will say, well, if my time on my computer is more than 5 minutes different from the domain controller, my user will not be able to log on or authenticate. That is absolutely false. The RFC, because I actually read it, the RFC actually says should not authenticate, not must not authenticate. And there's actually an RFC that explains the difference between will, must, should, could, might, stuff like that. So the RFC actually just says they should not be able to authenticate. Microsoft chose the more liberal interpretation of we don't care. It just says they should. Doesn't say they must not. So Microsoft will allow, you can be 18 minutes off, you can still authenticate. You will get an event recorded that you've got a time difference but you will still authenticate. Other things may not work right, but you will be able to authenticate. All right. Any question on that? All right, domain controller DNS IP setting configuration. Why is this important? Well, remember when I told you the second AD migration I worked on? Their DNS was so misconfigured that it actually depended upon which domain controller I was pointing to for DNS as to what name I received from DNS. And so you can get what's called DNS islands, which is still unfortunately very common, where people will point the domain controller to itself for DNS and no other domain controller. And then you run into a catch-22 that was supposed to have been fixed in 2012 R2, but it's still an issue. You can still run into a catch-22 where records won't update and things because they can't get around to other domain controllers. So how do I usually find domain controllers configured for DNS? Like a big old bowl of spaghetti. Absolutely no rhyme or reason. It's like every admin that set up a domain controller decided how they were going to configure the DNS settings on the domain controller's network interface. And there's no rhyme or reason, and things just kind of get out of whack. And then you also have the DNS silence where every domain controller just points to itself, which is not good. So the way it should be. Now, there is not any one way to do this. What you need to do is pick a standard and stay with that standard. So I recommend that the domain controller that hosts the PDC emulator FSMO row, because it is your most stable, reliable domain controller, and you've also configured it as your DNS scavenging server, that it is used as the primary DNS server for all domain controllers. And then the other domain controllers, will point to a second domain controller for secondary DNS, and then they all use or themselves. A lot of people will use they'll point to the PDC emulator for primary, and then each domain controller for secondary, and then loopback for tertiary DNS. And using loopback for tertiary is important because if the network stack or the TCP stack breaks for some reason, loopback will still work. The domain controller may take a little while to boot up, but it will boot up and find DNS on itself by using local loopback. And when a domain controller takes 10, 15, 20 minutes to boot up, that's when you know something is not right with its NIC or its DNS configuration. All right, what's wrong with this picture? The main thing wrong is, believe it or not, this usually happens in the smaller ADs, but they don't use OUs. All servers go into the computer OU, or sorry, computer's container, and all users and groups go into the user's container. The bad thing about that, you cannot directly link group policy to a container. So the computers and users containers, you cannot directly link an OU to them. So Microsoft's Active Directory guidelines, one forest, one domain, you use OUs for management and sites to control replication. The world's largest Active Directory follows those guidelines. Finding a multiple domain forest is rare, and it's usually done by misunderstanding. So for example, I got hired to help a pharmacy that decided it was time to expand, and their AD admin said that they were on target to acquire like 85 pharmacies over the next year. He wanted every pharmacy to be its own domain. And I was like, you want to have 85 child domains? Can you imagine the replication traffic? Can you imagine the management overhead? Can you imagine the DNS configuration of having to do conditional forwarders to, to get DNS to replicate and name resolution and all this stuff? I was like, that's not the way to do it. You just need one domain, the domain you're in, and then we can just migrate all these domains into OUs. Now, granted, the domain admins for those pharmacies are going to be pissed that they're no longer domain admins, that they're now OU admins. But now you have control over those OUs, and you can have control over the policies applied to those OUs. And because I was like, so what do you want to do if you become a huge and you get 1,000 pharmacies? You want to have 1,000 child domains? At some point, you're not going to be able to work. I said, Azure? Azure doesn't work that way. You think Azure has several 100,000 domains? All right. So those 4 items above will work for over 99% of all Windows Active Directory-based networks. People who have had child domains, we've been able to wean them off child domains. And then, I mean, I've had customers that have had child domains where they had 5 users and 5 computers in a child domain. It's like, what's the point? No point in even doing a migration. Just create new accounts and put them in the right groups, and you only got 5 computers, disjoin them from that domain and join them to the new domain. So what do OUs give you? OUs allow you to do delegation of permissions. So therefore, those old domain admins, you can delegate permissions of what they can and cannot do in those OUs, and allows you to apply group policy. And then of course, one of the things in, for most virtual desktop, virtual server, virtual application environments, you would have either a Citrix or Horizon or whatever top level OU, and you block inheritance at that OU, and then you apply group policies to your OUs you now create underneath there for your various Horizon pools or your Citrix delivery groups or whatever. Allows you very fine-tuned control. All right, so 10 steps to keep failure away from our virtualization projects. You're going to check your domain, enforce functional levels, get on at least 2008 R2 and 2008 R2 functional level, and migrate sysvol from FRF to DFSR. Make sure all domain controllers are global catalog servers. No manually created connection objects in sites and services. Check that net logon.log file for missing subnets, and then also monitor that event log for that event that's recorded every 60 to 75 minutes. That will tell you that that domain controller is, is servicing clients that don't have a subnet defined. Create reverse DNS lookup zones for all subnets and sites and services. Clean up DNS of unnecessary duplicate host names and IP addresses, whether manually or by implementing aging and scavenging. Obviously, I recommend aging and scavenging. Clean up orphan domain controllers, because believe it or not, orphan domain controllers are actually quite common, because most people don't know they're sitting out there in their environment until they bring me in to clean up, figure out what's going on with replication. Make sure the PDC emulator is configured properly to be the authoritative time source for the domain. Make sure all domain controllers have their DNS IP settings configured properly. And then use Microsoft's and other vendors' AD design guidelines to ensure you get the best results from your virtualization efforts. Now, there are like 80 some odd different things I look for when I do an Active Directory assessment or health check. These are just the 10 most common, and I find at least 9 out of the 10 in almost every environment. Even companies that have dedicated AD admins. Just because we're dedicated AD admins does not really mean they understand Active Directory. Just because you're a dedicated VMware admin doesn't mean you understand everything about every piece of VMware technology. Correct? There's no way. The same thing with Active Directory. You can't understand all the nuances involved in how everything all fits together. All right. Any questions?
My brain's still spinning.
Now, I do have a lot of references that are in the slide deck and in the PDF. And like I said, I sent David both the slide deck and the PDF. So you have one or both, whatever. They're all in there.
I already uploaded them to our community site.
Okay,
so.
Good. All right. And if you ever run into any questions or anything, just email me. I'm pretty hard to find. CarlWebster.com, Webster@CarlWebster.com, Carl Webster on Twitter, Carl Webster on Facebook, Carl Webster on LinkedIn. I'm pretty well hidden on the internet.
All right. If nobody has any questions, I guess, thank you very much, Carl. That's a lot of information. I know you and I have talked about some of the stuff quite a bit over the years. That some of it's already done in my environment, but there are a couple things that I found I don't have set up right. So, good. I will admit it.
And
right.
I am an independent consultant. So, here's my one sales call. If you do need, some help with AD or an AD health check, hey, just reach out to me.
Good deal. All right. Well, the next thing on our agenda is prizes or giveaways. So we have, I think, 5 giveaways tonight. Make sure before I do these that I have everybody on our list. Yeah, nobody's joined since I added it. So cool. So yeah, we have 5 giveaways. We have, they're mostly repeats from last month. We have a VMware mug, a VMware lunch kit. Actually, why don't I just share this thing out? Well, I'll try it. I'll try. And actually, I think I know what the problem is. Let me close Slack. I think because Slack got all jacked up after I tried to share out before. So.
No, sorry, Timothy. Darn.
$5 off, right?
No. I'll give you the VMUG Advantage discount.
10% off.
Yeah, I'll give you 10% off.
There it is. All right, here we go. Try. All right. Yeah, so it must have been Slack that was messing up because now it seems to be good. All right, so yeah, so these are the 5 items we have: the VMware mug, the VMware lunch kit, picnic backpack, which is pretty neat, VMware blanket, and the refresh glass, which, if you don't know what that is, it's where they've taken old wine bottles and made them into drink glasses. So that's pretty cool. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is spin this to see which item we're going to give away first. All right, so it looks like the blanket. Oh, there's confetti. Cool. All right, So it won't. It only let me do one window at a time. So the other window's got the names on it, and it spins for a long time. All right, Devin Tilley, you get the VMware blanket. So I need to note this down somewhere. Can one of the other leaders make notes for me on who wins what? We'll get that. So. I guess it's also being recorded, so I can always go back and watch that too. So, all right, VMware Lunch Kit. Goes to. All right, I can stop any day now. There we go. Nicholas Basham. So not only do I owe you a hat, I now owe you a VMware Lunch Kit. That has,
Okay.
it's like a little lunchbox thing with a bunch of other things in it. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about trying to coordinate again with you on this Sunday, but I can get with you offline.
All right, sounds good. And I hit the wrong button and did not take that off there. I don't want to give that away again. Okay. All right, so the VMware mug. We'll go to Nicholas Lloyd. And I still have your address from last month, so you got lucky the last 2 months. And all right, so the glasses. And it's actually 2 glasses. I only put 1 on this, but it's actually 2 to set. All right, Kent Clausen. So Kent, if you can message me your address or is Kent still on? I don't see him on. He must have. Oh yeah, he's on. He just doesn't have his video on anymore. So I'll get with you afterwards and figure out how we're going to do that. All right. Okay. Obviously, the last one is the VMware backpack, the picnic backpack. Oh, Brant made an appearance with the baby. All right, it's Vincent Escobar.
Yeah, cool. Okay, yeah, if you want to get with me afterwards, that'd be great.
Okay, will do.
Thanks.
Actually, if Kent and Vincent, if you guys could just email me your address, that would probably be the easiest. If you just send it to 4_Wayne@vmug.com, it's probably the easiest way for us to ship it to you. If that works out okay for you.
I can do. Thanks.
Yep,
All right.
no problem.
All right, so that's all the giveaways. All right, that's really all we have for tonight. Just a reminder of the upcoming events. Our April meeting will be April 21st. We don't have registration open yet because I'm trying to wait for word on whether we can meet in person or not. So it may be a few more days before we get that pushed out. If I don't hear, within a few more days, I will. They're supposed to decide tomorrow. I know they know I'm waiting on it. So if I don't hear within the next couple of days, then I will probably just make it a virtual event, assuming that's why they haven't gotten with me, and we can always change it back to an in-person if we need to. So, and even if we do it in person, we can still do the virtual. We've done that in the past for our recordings. We just haven't always opened it up, but we can probably do that. So,
yeah, I can look at hosting for this next one, just to do a hybrid event pretty easily.
good deal. Yeah, you have a great setup for that. Also, I know JP has offered to let us use Sweetwater facilities. They have a lot of rooms now that we're able to use, so we can always schedule something for out there at some point too. So, all right, I guess that's all we have. So, unless anybody has something we want to discuss with the group, we can call this a wrap.
All right. Well, again, thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you for sure. That's awesome. It's just funny how much stuff I haven't thought about in 5 years since I took over this role. Need to go back and look at again.
Yeah,
Yeah, for
super
sure.
helpful. Thank you.